empirical ones are a bit of a labor of love, and nothing makes me happier than to share this information with a community, which I think, I've had some conversations with some of you beforehand, and people have said to me, we need more information, and hopefully we'll help lay the foundation for a good, productive policy making. Everyone emphasizes the importance of doing database decision making, and I hope that we will contribute to that norm and make that more and more possible here. My name is Christopher Yoo. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where I actually hold appointments in communication and computer science as well. I'm told that makes me a bit of a unicorn, but I'll take that as a good thing, not something that's extinct. I'm the founding director of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition at the law school, where we are doing a number of initiatives, looking at new ways to connect more people to the internet in the developing world, trying to understand privacy and security for autonomous vehicles, trying to secure the critical infrastructure, intellectual property of all its kinds, international dimensions. Happy to talk to you about it. You have the annual report. You get an idea of the scope of what we do, and we're doing more all the time. We are proud to be co-sponsoring this event with the Penn Wharton Public Policy Institute. They are, if you will, the face of Penn in Washington, D.C. They emphasize empirical work and economic analysis on policy-relevant matters, and we're happy that I see our chief economist of the Federal Communications Commission and Wharton on leave, Wharton Professor. Katya Stein is joining us as well. We're very proud of the connections we have in DC, and we're very grateful to have all of you here. Also, so everyone in the room knows, we are webcasting this, and so we will have, is there a microphone for questions? Kevin? No. If there isn't one, I'll simply repeat the question and we go. It's one thing for the benefit of the audience at home, because this issue is of interest to people outside of Washington, D.C. as well. Just so everyone in the room knows, this is being webcast live to other people around the country, and that we will make sure that we engage people. All the off-microphone conversation will go out of our way to make sure it happens here. The program, as you see, I will begin with my remarks, followed by Governor Rendell, and then we will have Doug Holtz-Aiken and Frank Laufin come join us and offer their own remarks, and hopefully we'll have a very stimulating discussion from a wide variety of perspectives that will really help push the debate forward in ways that I think have not been done before. And so I also should acknowledge Timothy Fenninger, who's in the audience with us, who is the co-author of the paper and without whom none of this would be possible. So I deeply appreciate his help and his being here. All right. I'm happy to engage in more pleasantries, but someone told me that you are not here for all that. You're here to see the actual paper. So what's interesting is the paper was really motivated by a sense of a dearth of high quality or systematic empirical information. And it was really driven by a sense that was confirmed by my conversations with former governor and equally importantly for this purposes, former mayor of Philadelphia, Edward Rendell, is that city leaders know that the internet's becoming increasingly important. And in fact, whereas maybe 20 years ago it was the plaything of our children or more advanced people, it has now become the dominant way governments communicate with their citizens, we people apply for jobs, the way people get access to essential services of all kinds. We know that attaching, particularly in extremely rural areas, is very difficult, but cities have a problem. They have to figure out, they have a lot of other priorities. They have a lot of other demands. As important as I think the internet is, I'm well aware that it is not the only demand that's placed on city leaders. And they find that they're having to make tough choices in the margins about how to allocate resources. And what they find is that even though that there is a lot of interest and support for municipal fiber, you see this being debated in cities such as San Francisco right now is studying it, Seattle recently considered, and Palo Alto considered it and decided not to move forward. What you often see is a focus on some high-profile cases, most prominently Chattanooga is commonly discussed in the literature, and often done by people who are advocates in the space. So they're either picking certain stories on one side or the other because they think that it shows their position in a particularly favorable light. And I was thinking, if I were a city leader, what would I want? I would actually want systematic information. I would like a comprehensive analysis, not just of the ones that people think are success stories or failure stories based on which side of the issue you're advocating, but really to try to understand the comprehensive look, take a comprehensive look at all municipal fiber builds in the U.S. Based on the highest quality data that we have, which in my case is the official, all the official statements issued by the cities, their audited financial statements, and their filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission in support of their bonds submitted to the MSRB. And in fact, I was thinking, what would I want to know? Well, we would like to know how these projects are doing. You know, are they running in the red? Are they running in the black? And if so, how much? And even if you're a city who is interested and willing to take part of the revenue that you're generating from taxes and to support a muni fiber that doesn't completely break even, I would still want to know how far in the red it might potentially run, because if you don't know that, the risk just becomes unmanageable. And these become facts you'd like to know. And most importantly, if you support it with a bond, as most of them do, what's the likelihood that I'm going to be able to meet the debt service? Because if you don't meet the debt service, you're going to have to look at a default on the bond, or in the worst case, a bankruptcy, the insolvency of the entire city, which has happened, unfortunately, for at least one city that's built a municipal fiber project. You'd like to know how likely that is, because even if you're intending to do that, what that means is that all your subsequent bond issues on your roads projects, your school projects become more expensive, and it limits what you can do. And so you need to understand do this with eyes open to understand how this works. And to me, the best information for that is how previous cities run by very hardworking, very well-meaning public officials have done, because they've done their best, and we'd like to see how their best has turned out. And then lastly, to the extent that we have paths to success and failure, what were the factors that led different cities to be more likely in one or the other? To try to unpack the different aspects. And I'll tell you right now, I try to look at the construction costs, the operating costs, and how successful they were in signing up subscribers, because those are very different operational parts of the business. And we'll try to get some traction on which one's really determining the success. And the really idea here is to give the full range of the data, to let decision makers make up their own minds about what they think is the right thing to do. Because in the end, there was a lot of considerations that go into this. This is high-level data that, in the sense, we're taking a cross-section of all of them. There's a lot of individual details in the individual cases, which I'm sure can come out. And my point, the way an analysis has to work is you have to take a uniform approach to doing all of it. And we'll discuss some of the unique characteristics of some of the cities in the discussion of the actual cases. But the analysis is done on a straight level based on traditional financial analysis tools. So that's our goal. How are we going to do it? We're going to Tim and I gathered the official documents, the audited financial statements, and the SEC filings for every muni fiber build in the U.S. We used a source issued by the Executive Office of the President on community-based networks to identify them. We augmented it with industry-based sources to fill in the few that document missed. And in that process, we actually identified 88 municipal fiber builds, and then we used what we understand to be the generally accepted financial analysis tools. We stated we didn't want to compare apples to oranges, so we normalized things for $2,010, because obviously a project that was built in 2005 had paid a certain cost, but you really want to make that so that they're all equal. And we used the basic analysis, which is called net present value, on 5 years of data that we pulled for the cash flow and the actual cost of capital and the actual cost of the projects derived from the bond documents. We used that data to estimate how a hypothetical city might do on the aggregate data to try to project for the future. We actually tried to use the regression analysis to try to identify the factors that seem to be leading it towards success or towards failure. And then we did 7 detailed case studies, not as detailed as I'm sure are possible, because entire studies and reports have been written on each of these. Two of the first two are Bristol, Tennessee, and Vernon, California. These are the two that seem to be doing the best among the data set. And the others were chosen because they are very commonly talked about in the press and in the advocacy community as potential success stories. We wanted to take a look at them and see how they did. And so our basic project is to look at the numbers and then look at 7 case studies and try to use that to see what we can learn about how likely these are to succeed. So we ended up with 88 municipal fiber projects. That appears to be, as of 2014, the entire universe of muni fiber builds in the US. What's interesting is they are almost, as of this time, they were all located in areas where the city was already providing municipal power. And the reason for that is because municipal fiber generally needs access to rights of way. There are 3 examples of cities who are attempting now to build muni fiber networks without access to rights of way. They're going to incur greater costs, but they're just building now. There's not going to be in the data set. It'll be very interesting to see how they perform financially. If it is limited by where you have municipal fiber, just as a benchmark, 14% of the U.S. is served by municipal fiber, by municipal electric power. So if you need that kind of access to rights of ways, it turns out really this is an option that's open to 14% of the population. The audited financial statements for all 88 revealed we took 5 years of data just to take a snapshot, And as it turns out, only 20 of these cities report their financials for their broadband separately. The other 68 offer a single consolidated financial statement for both the internet operations and their electric power operations. And in fact, we try to analyze whether there's a bias in this. There doesn't seem to be. If anything, I know anecdotally from talking to people who report on this, that you tend to do this if you're trying to mask the bad performance of one or the other by aggregating at a higher level. Don't know exactly the details on a systematic way, but there's this is the data, all the data that's available through audited financial statements, and so it's the data we use to conduct our analysis. And from the SEC filings, of those 20 projects, 13 filed documents with the FCC. And for those projects, we took the actual project cost as reported in the bond documents and the actual cost of capital that they used. For the 7 remaining projects, we took the median cost of project on a per household basis and the median cost of capital from the existing data set of the 13 and used those as estimates for what the project cost and the cost of capital would be for those 7 that did not file with the SEC. And again, that's, those are estimates more than the others. We can play around with that. You'll see, I'll point them out as we go through the analysis so you know which ones are which. But the point of it is, this is based on empirical data as we've got it. And unless we believe that the 7 who did not file have substantially different cost of capital or different project costs, it should serve as a relatively adequate estimate, we hope. Who are these cities? The 20 cities are, the median is 24,000 residents, 10,000 homes. The smallest is Vernon, California, which is one of the high-flying performers, but we'll talk about why. And the largest is Chattanooga. The oldest began in 2000, that's Fayetteville, Tennessee, and the newest actually began in 2010, so it doesn't have 2010 results. It only has 2011 results, so it's a 4-year study. The project costs vary from the median is 22 million. The highest is 185, and that's Utopia in Utah. The lowest is Kutztown, Pennsylvania, 5.8 million. The cost of capital ranges from 5.11 at the median, from a low of 3.9 to a high of 10.77. I should point out the Utopia one, they chose to use a floating rate, which actually did cause them some problems. Interestingly, whenever we had a choice, we tried to use the most conservative assumption we would find. Because Utopia actually runs very large negative numbers, the high cost of capital actually makes their numbers look better because it actually makes the lost years, the out years look smaller. So in fact, that is using the higher cost of capital is the more conservative assumption to use. So those are our cities. What do? We actually calculated used their financial statements to calculate their cash flows. I won't burden you with it's all discussed in the paper, but this is a very standard thing anyone who takes accounting learns how to do. We used the discount, the actual cost of capital that they paid to restate them all in $2010. And we then looked at how they did, took an average of how they did in that 5-year period and compared it to how much it cost and said, at the rate that these projects actually achieved from 2010 to 2014, how long would it take them to pay back the project cost? In other words, how long would it take this to break even? And based on that, after that, we looked at 3 possibilities. If it's cash flow negative, this is a venture that not only has borrowed money to get built, but the debt is going to continue to grow because its current operations are not covering its expenses, and that in fact they will be shedding red ink, and unless they find some way to arrest or change that direction, they're going to face very difficult questions about how long they're going to keep operating, and usually it means finding a private operator to sell to. If cash flow is positive, the question is how big. If it's fairly small, this is an organization that will not be running in the red, so it won't be racking up debt. But eventually that long-term bond, typically 30 years, will come due. And at that point, unless they have sufficient reserves or are on track to do it, they will not be able to service the bond. And in the cases where cash flow is sufficiently positive, you can tell a very happy story. You try to match the revenue to the expense. These tend to be 30 to 40-year bonds. The typical thing in the financial statement says the projected life of these networks, all of them say, is 30 to 40 years. So the benchmark we're going to use is to see whether these projects will cover their expenses in 30 to 40 years. So that, in a nutshell, is the overall setup. And now I'll give you the results. So I apologize. The table is in your paper, is in there, but from the distance, it's a little bit hard to read. So I'll try to walk you through it. What we have here is the annual. The first column is the cities themselves. The second column is how much they generated in an average year. The third column is how much the project cost, all normalized for 2010 dollars. And the fourth column is to tell you how likely it would be to break even, how many years it would take to break even. So starting here, just looking at the basics, the bottom 11 of the 20 are cash flow negative. So 55% of the cities in this study are actually shedding red ink. These cities not only borrowed to build the networks, but they're actually incurring additional debt as they operate. And so the question then we ask is, we actually, if you look at the report, we try to assess whether 2010 to 14 was representative of its long-term performance. We looked at the age of the project, we looked at revenue growth, and tried to make some estimate based on that to see how successful they're going to be. And in fact, you'll see that in the case studies when we talk about them. We didn't change the numbers, but when we discuss them, we decide how they're going to do. The worst case here, and this is really unfortunate, they've actually already defaulted on their bonds, is Monticello, Minnesota. They borrowed $27 million to build this project. They lost $5 million a year from 2010 to 2014. So they basically lost virtually the same size of the project cost in the 5 years of operating. And they have already defaulted on the debt. The interesting question is, in addition, they're continuing to lose money, and they're going to be in very dire straits unless they find a way to materially change their operations. You'll see different ranges. To take a case in the middle, just because it's useful and it's used in the press so often, Chattanooga, Tennessee is often called Gig City. It's constantly talked about in the New York Times, someone sent in the Washington Post and CNN as an example that other city that proves the idea that municipal fiber is a good idea. They are cash flow positive, $400,000 a year in the 5-year period we measured. They borrowed $160 million in the beginning to finance it. So 400,000 times 160 million, for those of you who are lawyers, and the reason you went to law school is you don't do math, that's a little over 400 years. That does not count the $111 million in stimulus money they received to do a smart grid initiative that they built into this. If you actually add that in, it becomes closer to a 700-year payback rate. So they are operating in the cash flow positive. They do continue to generate positive cash flow, so they're not incurring more debt as they go. But they are not generating the kind of reserves they need to be able to pay off the $162 million debt service that will eventually come due when, in a large balloon towards the end of the bond. The two interesting success stories are complicated. So Vernon, California is by far the biggest success story. It supposedly recovered its costs in 2 years. Vernon is a very strange city. It is an industrial city with, I think, like thousands of employees and 100 residents. It's basically in California. It's a transportation and industrial hub. This network was not built for residences. This network was built for businesses. And so estimating the cost on a per household basis is not going to yield. We did it for consistency because that's how you do an analysis. But as a matter of discussion, we actually pulled the balance sheet. That number seems closer to $3 million in actuality, which would give it a 100-year payback, and it seems to be much in line with the mainstream of what we're doing. The other city that's slightly more promising and more normal is Bristol, Tennessee. In contrast, so you know there are two Bristols. Bristol, Virginia gets a lot of publicity, which is a unit called Bristol, Virginia Utilities, or BVU Optical. And in fact, this is Bristol, Tennessee Essential Services, and there are sister cities on either side of the border. It actually has a chance to pay back in 34 years. Now, the interesting thing that you have to be careful about Bristol is, of the 5 years of data, 2 years of which they only offered DSL. It was only in the last 3 years they offered fiber. If you only look at the fiber offerings, this picture doesn't come quite so rosy. But then we have to sit there and look at it. It's the very first years of the offering. How is that going to develop? It's probably not representative of how it's going to go. But that's something you have to unravel in all that. The two other cities that have some promise, Fayetteville, Tennessee, and Windham, Minnesota, are right now showing paybacks on the order of 60 years. That's not outside the range of what's feasible. And given where they are, it's possible their operations will improve, while those may become more positive. So, but for the others, they're all looking at a century or more, some significantly more than a century, and some, unless they turn a cash flow positive, there's not a story about how they're going to get to pay off their debt. So to try to make this a little bit more tractable, I put all these up in terms of the percentage in a given year of the total debt service they had to cover. And the hope would be on a 40-year time horizon, you would cover at least 2.5% of your debt a year. And that's the red vertical line. And you can see here, again, Bristol and Vernon are the only two above the line. We have a number that are positive but below the line. And then the large 55%. 55% are cash flow negative, 35% are cash flow positive, but below 2.5%, and only 10% are cash flow positive. And we have to look at them and to understand in the details of how likely they are to be replicable. So what will we do next? We actually projected a hypothetical project. We have projects aged from the age of 0 to 14. So we simply looked at how much cash flow they generated per household and averaged them across all our cities. And if you take that as a 14-year estimate, what we find out is in the first 14 years, the average project will lose $2,920 per household. I always think of this as if I was voting for this, I would have to be a voter who'd be willing to spend $3,000 in tax money to build this project and believe that paid out in the community. We actually did some back-of-the-envelope calculations about how much tax revenue it would have to generate to make this pay out, how much different growth rates, and there's ways you can analyze it to get traction around it. But the first half of the project is not positive. We did regressions to do linear regressions. These are linear projections, straight line projections. Now we have very few data points, so we don't achieve statistical significance, but based on the estimates, we put it without controls. We have over 115 years. If you drop out Vernon because it's an outlier, it's roughly the same. If you include controls for median income by city and population density, it's still an 80-year payback without Vernon and the 136 with. The problem with the linear regression is it projects that your project will grow forever. And we know from most technologies that doesn't happen. They have an S-curve aspect where they flatten out and hit saturation. There is a transformation you can do to regressions to match it to an S-curve, which we did, and you'll see this all in the appendices of the report. Based on that, it's 318-year payback and 109 if you take out Vernon. So what you see based on this data, again, not enough to achieve statistical significance, but just as point estimates, we have estimates that are relatively consistent with the larger data set based on how we looked at it. The regression we did on the drivers of success and failure, it looks that that we did two sets of regressions, again, including Vernon because it's the whole data set, and you like to just do it that way. We also excluded them in case they're an outlier. The ones that included, that were on the entire data set identified, and this is on 20 observations, found statistical significance to keeping the operating expenses were really the problem. Is that keeping your costs down, not in building, but in operating really became the huge obstacle. It makes sense. You do one-time costs up front. The operating expenses accumulate over every single year, and if you're not doing that well, that leverages and adds forever. And then interestingly, if you actually take out the Vernon from it, it looks like revenue generation becomes more important in one of the specifications, weekly so. Again, with 1920 observations, you don't expect to get much, but basically what you're seeing is that it's actually, you have to go out and get customers and convince that they want to do this. So part of it's not just maintaining and operating a network, but actually the business marketing of it. It turns out that keeping projects down is less important, and in terms of the coefficients, the operating expenses by far, by several orders of magnitude, the most important. The capital expenses tend not to be that big a deal, which is a bit of a surprise. So the key takeaways, more than half of these projects operate in the red. 90% if they duplicate the results they've achieved from 2010 to 2014, that's the important caveat, based on the data, 90% would not cover their costs within their bond period, which means that they would either have to then reissue the bonds, but for something that doesn't have a projected life beyond that, that is an unorthodox thing to do. And basically, you're then taking essentially bond revenue to finance operations. 10% will cover costs, but have some things about them that make them challenging to abstract out as generalities. The case studies show in some detail the problems that individual cities have run into. The things that really struck me is that when you read these, you're actually really struck by the anguish that the city leaders go through. I mean, they went into these with great intentions and believing that they were doing well. And the ones that have done well have done very well. That's good for the cities. The ones that have struggled, they find that they spend a lot of their time on issues that weren't why they went into public service to them. And in fact, what we also find is a lot of these went in areas where there was an existing competitor. The existing competitor, their price reacts, which is the natural thing. It's one of those things that it's a classic trap that we learn in business school. Is you look at your competitor, you go in at a certain price, and you figure, well, I can beat that price, but you forget that they're not just going to stand still and do that. This is what economists would call the Cournot assumptions. That you have to look at what their best response is likely to be. And that, in fact, that is a classic planning problem that inexperienced business people of all kinds make, and that should be no surprise replicated here. The other thing that we found in the individual case studies, there is substantial evidence that some some utilities are making up for the shortfall of their broadband operations by transferring money from their electric utility operations. If they're doing that on a short-term basis as financing with proper documentation, that's permitted. If they're doing it not properly, that actually almost always violates state law. State law requires electric utility rates, customers to pay for electric utility costs and not pay for broadband. And the broadband cost should pay for itself. You're actually not supposed to cross-subsidize in this manner. It's a matter of simple fairness. And that, in fact, there have been a number of lawsuits brought by actually, there's two very high-profile investigations, both in Utah and Virginia, of muni-fibers bills for violating this. There's also always zoning regulations, zoning fights, all these other things that accompany this, and that has to be taken into account as part of the problems. And in fact, we have to see how all that plays out when you make these plans. I wouldn't be an academic if I didn't offer some caveats. This is based on 5 years of data, not the entire project cost data. And as every financial person will tell you, as Frank would always tell you, past results do not predict future performance. Just because they achieve this in 5 years doesn't mean that's a guarantee that it will continue to do so in the future. It may do better, it may do worse. What we have to do is analyze the situation and make a prediction about what that's going to happen. Young projects have room to grow, technology gets better, people want the technology more. There's a lot of things that can go up. There's a lot of things that can go down. It's just a matter of doing the analysis, and this is why it's important that every city make their own judgments based on their unique situation, because no two cities, as the former mayor will tell you, are exactly alike. But the thing is, and if the city's thinking about it as a broadband as investment, I still think it's useful to know how projects have done in the past, to see how this goes. And really, the reality is they have to think about what would happen in not just the best case scenario, but the worst case scenarios, and to try to find out what the reactions would be. And in fact, that is a bit of a challenge for everyone. And I hope that this data is the kind of data that people will find helpful as they wrestle with these kinds of decisions. All right, thank you. So it is my pleasure at this point to acknowledge the fact that we are joined with an exquisite number of other participants in this event. And the most important, which is to me, is I wanted different perspectives presented from different people who've had to make the hard choices around municipal fiber. And honestly, I cannot think of anyone who is more uniquely qualified to offer this perspective than the Honorable Edward Rendell. He has a 24-year career in public service, going back to when he began as a district attorney. But most importantly for this project, he's actually faced the real decisions that a mayor has to face in terms of choosing how he's going to allocate a limited number of resources and a very large number of demands. And then, after doing 2 terms and 8 years as mayor of the city of Philadelphia, he then served 2 terms as governor of Pennsylvania and saw the realities at the next layer of government, and even served the country as the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and has seen government on all its different levels. And it's a perspective that I think is extremely rare for him to bring in his own experience. He continues to effectuate this in his own work. He's a part of a coalition called, he's the co-founder and leader of a coalition called Building America's Future, which is studying how to do infrastructure construction in the United States now, which, as anyone who reads the headlines knows, is a very, very important issue, and we need his guidance and the guidance of the team of great experts he's collected. He is also senior counsel at Ballard Spahr and continues to be active in many ways. And I have to admit, the fact that he is a University of Pennsylvania graduate and a Philadelphia Eagles fan is not the reason I invited him, but is a very pleasant bonus in being able to do so. So without further ado, Governor Edward Rendell.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Hello, everyone. I am a proud Penn graduate, as is my wife and my son, Jesse. We're proud of Penn. I am proud to be the only Penn graduate elected both mayor of Philadelphia and governor of Pennsylvania. That was one condition we didn't have, and we didn't have a president of the United States who graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. Now, secondly, Doctor is right. I have been involved in the fight to revitalize America's infrastructure. Actually, from the time I was mayor, I agreed to be chair. I succeeded Bob Lanier, the wonderful mayor of Houston, as chair of something called Rebuild America, which went out of existence in the early 2000s. Rebuild was dedicated to the idea that we needed to do something with our infrastructure. That need has only increased dramatically. In 2004, we were rated the best infrastructure in the world, both in terms of quality and economic competitiveness by the World Economic Forum. Today, we are rated the 11th best infrastructure in the world. We need to get moving on our infrastructure, and we need to get moving on it quickly. BAF has endorsed the need, obviously, to have a comprehensive infrastructure bill. But we've also strongly endorsed the concept that when we talk about infrastructure, we're not just talking about roads, bridges, and highways, transportation infrastructure. We're talking about the entire infrastructure, including the electric grid and including broadband. And that is a very important point, and I am happy to say the Trump administration, to the extent that it has said anything meaningful on infrastructure, does include non-transportation infrastructure in the concept of infrastructure. Building America's Future has really become, I would say, the leading advocate for infrastructure revitalization. It was started in 2008 by myself, Democrat, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California, Republican, and Mike Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, who at the time was an independent. And all three of us had put our money where our mouth was and made substantial investments in infrastructure. Mayor Bloomberg has continued, speaks for us on occasion. The Bloomberg Foundation provides us with significant funding. Governor Schwarzenegger helped us out and would do press conferences in California. But his greatest contribution to the infrastructure battle was the day we announced this in California in 2008 in a island in the middle of a California freeway at 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, still pretty scary. He said, highlighting a problem we had back then, he said that when his 8-year-old son saw on his schedule that he had a press conference involving infrastructure, he said his son asked him, "Daddy, what's infrastructure?" And Governor Schwarzenegger replied, "It's what Daddy blows up in the movies." Probably as good a definition as there is. But we've come a long way in raising the consciousness of America about infrastructure from 2008. So it is my hope that when we do infrastructure, we will do it in a robust way. We will spend the right amount of money. We will do long-term planning, and we will take on issues like the issue of broadband. This is a very, very important issue, and I think the doctor's paper gives a very clear and important picture of the problems that mayors, particularly mayors of mid-sized cities, but not just mayors of mid-sized cities, mayors of rural cities or rural towns face. And it gives one side of the dilemma, and it's an important side, and I think it'll be valuable for mayors as they try to make their own decisions about what to do. But where I think, and it wasn't the job of the paper, but where I think as part of the broad discussion we didn't go is, okay, Mayor, you're not going to make an investment. How in the heck are you going to get access, if you're a little rural town, to internet for your town? Or if you're in a mid-sized city, how are you going to get access at a price level and a quality level that will allow businesses to come to your town and compete? That's the big question. And the doctor's paper is extraordinarily important in highlighting the dilemma. But now I think we need to look at some choices. As you all know, 10 years ago, the United States deregulated high-speed internet access. Let me show you what that has wrought. Can we show, I have one slide. I don't know how closely you can see that. The slide, the yellow line is megabits per second downloads, and the blue line is price per month. And it is a random sample of countries. U.S. is at the bottom. You will see that we lead the pack in the blue lines, meaning we are by far the most expensive country in the world. To give you an example, residents in New York pay about $55 a month, nearly double of what the residents in London, Seoul, Bucharest, Romania pay. Residents in such cities like Hong Kong, Seoul, Tokyo, and Paris get connections nearly 8 times faster than we do. The yellow line shows the speed of connectivity, and you can see countries like South Korea, France, Slovenia dominate us. And by the way, this chart didn't just pick highly developed nations. You'll see that the Slovak Republic is on the chart, Estonia on the chart, Slovenia on the chart. It is, as most things involving infrastructure, embarrassing to be a U.S. citizen and look at this chart. What caused this problem? Well, so 2 ways to hold down pricing and to ensure quality. Way number 1 is oversight, or that's a sort of euphemism for government control. And we do that. We do that. Interestingly, if you analogize high-speed internet access to other forms of basic needs for cities, energy, let's take energy and water. They are both, just like high-speed internet, mostly provided by the private sector. But what's the difference? Difference is that energy and water are highly regulated. Commissions, usually the public utility commissions in most states, regulate pricing. Companies have to go, if they want to raise prices, have to go and get the PUC's permission to do it, the Public Utility Commission permission to do it. And they regulate access, and they regulate the quality of service. Oversight, control. Once we decided to deregulate, we have lost any sense of oversight and control. Same thing with pricing. Once we chose to deregulate, we've lost anything. Pricing. It's interesting, analogizing this to just a famous example of deregulation. Looking at the crowd there, some of you are old enough to remember when there were 14 full-service airlines running in the United States carriers, United States companies, 14. Among them, the leader was Eastern Airlines, who had the most employments of any company in the world. I remember I was a young DA, but Eastern Airlines had done stuff to help us. So there was a luncheon at the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, and Frank Borman was the speaker. So the local Eastern guys asked me if I would sit at the table with Frank Borman. I said, sure. And Frank Borman got up and gave an impassioned plea for deregulation, which was already happening. It was due to happen in about a half a year from the day that Frank Borman spoke. Deregulation occurred, and in less than a year after deregulation, Eastern Airlines was out of business. We now have 3 airlines, and it is 3 times cheaper to fly from Philadelphia to Denver than it is to fly from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. No bloody sense. All controlled by market prices and competition. No carrier other than American Airlines that flies from Philadelphia. Number of carriers that fly from Philadelphia to Denver, which is cheaper even though it's 3 times. Pittsburgh. So that's where we are. Now, competition or lack thereof is clearly the one culprit. Because after deregulation, what happened is there were a lot of consolidations and mergers, and we now have so little competition. For example, when Time Warner wanted to merge with Charter, immediate reaction of some of the advocates was this is going to be anti-competition. No, it wasn't, because Time Warner and Charter weren't in any city anywhere in the United States at the same time. That's how little competition there is today. Consider the following. Half of American homes have only 2 options of the internet service providers for basic broadband, according to the FCC. For faster speeds, a majority of households have only 1 provider. The leading reason for this is that the cost of entry is so high. In America, unlike in virtually every other country in the world, new companies, new broadband providers are not allowed to piggyback on the fiber lines that are laid by the telecoms. In other countries, they are. So that's why it's so much easier for startups to get into the market in other countries than they are in the U.S. But consider research that the Annenberg School, unfortunately not the Annenberg School at Penn, but the Annenberg School at USC came up with. 2/3 of Angelenos live in areas served by just one internet provider that offers speeds meeting the FCC Commission's basic broadband service definition. Think about that. And even worse, for fiber-based services, only 25% of Los Angelenos can get fiber-based services, whereas in Stockholm and Paris, 100% of the citizens have access to fiber-based services. Not surprising, because in Paris, there are 6 different competitors if you want to purchase broadband. 6 different competitors. So, what's a mayor to do? Mayor's looking at this problem, looks at Dr. Yoo's report, and shudders down his spine. Like when I was mayor, when I would hear the snow was in the forecast, it would send shudders down my spine, because I was thinking of all the money it was going to cost us in overtime to clear up the snow. I'll never forget the second day I was no longer mayor. I got up early because I was taking a train down to Washington, and I looked out the window and it was snowing. And that old familiar chill went down my spine, and then a few seconds later I realized, not my job. So the mayor is left with a quandary. He sees the report, he understands the problems, he understands it's not likely to make financial sense. That's the cost of doing something. The cost of doing something, meaning building your own municipal fiber network, is almost prohibitive and incredibly risky. But what's the cost of doing nothing? The infrastructure debate, we always talk about the cost of doing nothing. Because if we were to raise the gas tax 10 cents a gallon, index it to inflation, that's the Corker-Murphy bill. Corker, of course, being a conservative Republican, still is on the bill. That would cost the average driver who drives 12,000 miles a year $140 in increased taxes. But the average driver pays, according to the Texas Transportation Institute, not exactly a liberal think tank, pays $818 a year in cost of gas, idling traffic, costs of injuries to cars or tires. If you go over a pothole and your tire just gets off axle, it's going to cost you $250. If you need a brand new tire, it may cost you $400 or $500. The cost of doing nothing. So the mayor's looking at it, and he looks at Dr. Yoo's report. Boy, this is terrible. This is going to cost us. Well, what's the cost of doing nothing? Not only do you not deliver quality service or access in smaller towns for your schools and your residents, but for your businesses and your own government, you can't be competitive. What business that does any sort of marketing outside of its tight little geographic area is going to go to a town that doesn't have internet access? What startup? You may have some bright young people coming up with a great idea. You'd want to keep them in your town. How can they stay? They can't get on the internet. They can't sell over the internet. Who's going to come? Who's going to stay? So cost of doing something, clearly the report shows that quite graphically. Cost of doing nothing to be computed, balanced. So it is not so easy. Now, if it were up to me, and I am obviously a Democrat, and I would judge myself to be a sensible progressive, I think we should go back to oversight. I'll tell you why. When I was governor, there was an act in Pennsylvania called Act 30, which was the act that laid out the basic parameters for the telecom companies. In my time as governor, we had to reauthorize Act 30. It was very important to the telecom companies that we reauthorize it. There were a lot of gems in there that they wanted. Well, we extracted, as part of the conditions for reauthorizing, we extracted their commitment to increase access to places where it wasn't particularly feasible, subsidize to some degree the prices. Because access is number one. In rural towns, there's no access at all. But then affordable pricing is the second. You can say, well, it's just like, I love I love the Republicans on healthcare. They say, well, everyone in America will have access to healthcare. Yeah, they'll have access. It's like saying everyone in America can legally buy a Mercedes-Benz. But they can't afford it. So what good is access if you can't afford it? So we have to do something about pricing. We have to do something about access. We have to do something about control. And how are we going to do that? Municipal competition, all of its risks, is one way to do it. Balance. And what I think we should use Dr. Yoo's wonderful paper as is a springboard for a national discussion on how are we going to give access at an affordable price and at decent speeds to the parts of the country that don't have it, and how do we get reasonable pricing and decent speed to places like urban Los Angeles or urban Philadelphia or urban Dallas or whatever. It's a discussion that should be part of whatever infrastructure money is dedicated to broadband. That infrastructure money, in my judgment, should come with some very strict requirements. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. And if Frank and Doug would come join us, we would love to continue on the next part of the program. So it is my pleasure to introduce both Doug and Frank. So Doug has been gracious to join us. He does have a back-end constraint, so he will have to excuse himself during the program. And so we will, of course, let him speak first, just in the interest of time, and also is in the question and answer period that will follow this after the panel discussion. I would encourage you to engage Doug early and often while he's still with us, and then we'll continue on without him. Doug has, the panel, as you may see, one of the reasons I really love the idea of having Doug here is that he has worked has a federal perspective. He was in the CBO, which, as most of you know, is a nonpartisan organization that reports to Congress, whose primary responsibility is to score the budget implications, the financial implications of different bills as they're proposed, to make sure that we understand their
Not
impact.
anymore.
Well, yeah. And then he was the head of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House as well, has been very active in public life. And we welcome your perspective on this, Doug.
Thank you, sir. So I want to thank Christopher and Governor Rendell for the chance to join this panel. And I also want to point out that I'm going to represent Western Pennsylvania and the very successful Pittsburgh Steelers. This is a really important and timely paper, and it certainly informs the debate over municipal broadband. But when I read it, what really jumped out to me was that it informs these larger debates as well. And certainly one of them is the issue of what will be the path forward on infrastructure. This is, I think, a unique opportunity to do some things that would genuinely enhance national connectivity, improve national economic performance, and to have a sensible infrastructure program at this juncture is something that I think should be really considered part of any real pro-growth strategy for the United States. And I think this fits into that debate and informs sort of a couple of key things that you want to ask. Number one, where do you want to draw the circle? I think Governor Rendell mentioned this. What's inside the circle and is considered infrastructure from the purposes of using federal taxpayer dollars, and what's outside. And thus far, broadband has been considered something that's inside that circle and meritorious of consideration. Second key decision is, do you want to provide some broadband services to individuals as part of this? That decision is pretty straightforward. The second question is the one the paper actually informs a lot, which is, do you actually want to put the public sector in the production business, or is it going to hire the private sector, as is typically done, to provide this service to targeted constituencies? And this is a paper that's very much on the production decision. I think it's relatively rare that we see a real good set of analyses of the government production of a particular service. So I really want to point that out. I think it's important from that perspective. Third sort of debate this feeds into, at least to my eyes, because I've been through a bunch of these, is almost every time we get involved in a large public debate, we end up with the public option fight. When I was the CBO director, we did the Part D prescription drug program. Few people remember that there was a public option embedded in that. It was never actually used. It was meant to be a backup. There were regional backup plans if the private sector didn't provide prescription drugs to seniors. We went through the public option debate in the ACA, and since then, we had the co-ops in the Affordable Care Act. This is really the public option in broadband, and you know, it sheds light again on how you want to think of the objectives of these kinds of initiatives. Are they merely the provision of a broadband service to a citizen, or do they serve a larger competitive purpose to correct something that's not going on out there in the private sector, in which case you might accept a lower standard for financial performance because you're getting some benefit elsewhere. And I think it's important to think about sort of where this fits into that sort of competition question. So I just want to congratulate him for writing a good paper on this. And I'm a numbers guy, so I always love it when it's past, like, you know, talking about it. Here are the numbers. Let's see how these perform. So the key question always in these things is the government going to have to subsidize this? If so, why? Paper doesn't really inform very much. The case studies didn't seem to document. But I'm just curious, in the debates leading up to these decisions in these cities, was there a conscious thought that the consumers needed to get an extra subsidy because of their characteristics, or was this just a matter of the fact that we weren't getting good competitive performance out of the broadband providers? So what kind of subsidies are going to be in there, and for how long? In some cases, these things are going on for quite some time, cash flow negatives, and you might even decide to do that as a matter of public policy, but you need to have somewhere out here a set of benefits to counteract the costs that the paper documents so very clearly. And then there's a second question, which I'd encourage them to think a little bit about, which is, if you want to think of this as simply, we've got two options for providing broadband. We've got a private sector option and a public sector option. The real question is, if we take these dollars from the private sector and put them in the public sector, do we get the same rate of return on them? And the calculation you've done doesn't really inform that, because you're using the all debt weighted average cost of capital. Yes. I'd encourage you to do these present value things with an equity cost of capital in there and see what they look like then, because that's really informative of the question, where are you getting the relative efficiencies if you're going to get just broadband services out there. So I think that would be fantastic. But you know, those are I think the main things to look at in this. It's a tremendous paper. I think the authors did a good job of being honest about both the strengths and the weaknesses. You know, this is a small window over what are long-lived projects, and there's nothing you can do about that, but you do wonder about the nature of the extrapolation via regression, always a dicey activity. The second thing you'd spent less time on, but I think is worth thinking hard about, is what is the nature of the selection bias that gives you the 20 independent financial statements as opposed to the other 68 who you don't get to look at, and what does that tell us about this? And people smarter about this topic than me can think about that and sort of see if it leads a bias one way or the other. But I'm just delighted to have a chance to read the paper and enjoy the chance to comment on it. Look forward to the conversation.
And our final speaker is Frank Laufin, who works at Raymond James as an analyst and director of equity analysis. He is bringing the other perspective, which is the other vital part of these projects is the finance community. These are the people who actually are responsible for making sure they place these bonds, finding them, are in charge of servicing them, helping the workouts when they go bad. And what's quite striking to me is an answer to a question that you raised directly, Doug, is these projects are sold as pay-as-you-go, no taxpayer money projects. And so if nothing else, and one of the things that strikes me, if we believe that's not going to hold, that taxpayers need to do it with their eyes open. But if they are sold that way, the perspectives that Frank brings from the investor community becomes absolutely critical, because that's how people are going to be, that is how the projects are going to be analyzed on their own terms. Frank.
Great, thank you. Very much appreciate the other panelists here, Professor Yoo, for inviting me. I cover the telecom, cable, and data center sectors for Raymond James. I cover the RBOX. I cover rural carriers. I cover cable companies, kind of everyone, and competitive CLECs, everybody in between. Just as a brief disclosure, I don't own any shares of stock of any of the companies we'll cover. My firm may do investment banking business with some of them. If you're interested in more details on that, you let me know. But this is This is excellent work that Professor Yoo has done. It's kind of the best that I've seen. I've looked at some of this data in the past, and I just stopped because some of the roadblocks that the professor pointed out, they're not very forthcoming with the information. I usually refer to that with investors as things that are not done for our benefit. When you're hiding in, when you're putting the data in with as the professor said, with other electric utilities and other parts of the project. It's very difficult to find a broad swath of data for this. And then the additional hidden subsidies that aren't in there that were more challenging for me to find, such as additional government subsidies, the cost of rights of way. It's not there. There is a cost there, but it's usually ignored in a lot of the analysis. And then just the other thing that I think is a big impediment that for the carriers that I cover is just the red tape. The city doesn't give itself as much of a hassle with doing permitting and getting things done as they do with a carrier, where they've got to kind of have a handout. In general, the companies that I cover would like to provide services to many of these markets, and I am very sympathetic to rural markets and small areas. I live in flyover country. I'm not in New York, and so I've been to a lot of these small towns, and I understand the dilemma that the governor's mentioning. There's something needs to be done. I think in general people underestimate the willingness of large carriers to provide services there, but there has to be a little bit of give and take. One of the other problems with the municipal builds, as I've looked at them, is immediately the small town gives all the city business or the small college or the hospital to the new municipal network. Well, there goes the anchor tenants, and there goes so if you ever thought that the rural phone company or cable company we're going to build in, they're certainly not now, because it's suddenly become really upside down. They just lost a lot of revenue. And then they give themselves, the free rights away and so forth. I think those are kind of things that potentially cities should consider. If it's not going to necessarily be free to taxpayers and they can put in some cost, then maybe using rights away, other things, or contracts with the carriers to help ensure that they've got some cash flow for what otherwise might be a marginal project, but you could make the deal easier. I think that would do a lot. The Vernon, California is it's really interesting. When you're selling to businesses, it's a completely different proposition. I saw that I knew something had to be up. I'm digging into that. That's kind of interesting. And then the other thing I think is interesting, the professor's analysis about the OpEx really kind of killing things. And it gets to kind of the last point that I think municipalities forget is the ongoing cost and then upgrades. Technology doesn't stand still. We're going to build the greatest network that we can today. What happens 10 years from now or 15 years from now? Or just we need to upgrade. Even if you're staying on an IP network, you need to upgrade routers and throughput and so forth. That's often ignored and forgotten in the analysis, and that's where the cities, even if you did the best plans, it's not their core competency to look forward. So that's where, considering trying to find a way to entice an incumbent or another carrier in there. And then operating costs. Just think about how you manage truck rolls. I talk to my cable companies, the phone companies. They'll talk in terms of, hey, if we can get the average talk time for the call center down from 6 minutes down to 4. That's 2 minutes. 2 minutes times 24 hours a day. And that's people and dollars, and it's very expensive. And being able to get the logistical aspect of getting trucks roll in places. From my own experience, I would say most municipalities have dealt with probably not very efficient with how they use trucks and infrastructure. So then to put that on a project that is going to need this, as obviously a broadband infrastructure probably takes a lot less time and effort than maybe other things, but it still does require some. All those are very important. And I think the last point I make is to the infrastructure project. I'm fairly encouraged with what the administration may do on infrastructure. I think the key thing is to make sure we're not subsidizing where there's already existing infrastructure. That'll be chasing dollars where it doesn't need to be. And again, we see municipalities are overbuilding existing infrastructure. As I pointed out, it often sucks the life out of the ability for those that are probably best equipped to do this. So anyway, I think it's excellent work. Really sheds a light on a problem, and I think there are a lot of ways that the public carriers and others can help.
I just want to jump in real quickly on one thing Frank said. It is enormously important that when the infrastructure bill is structured and passed, that it does not pay or give tax credits for projects that are already in the pipeline. Then we will have done nothing. We will have created not one new job, not one new road, not one repaired bridge. We will have just given rich people a tax credit. We need to find a way to make sure that this is all for new projects, projects that are not in the pipeline, et cetera. It has to be crafted very carefully when you're dealing with tax credits to make sure we're not doing this. Also, the original Trump plan had credits in there for the constructors. Well, the constructors in Pennsylvania, everyone builds in about a 9% profit margin. They don't need any additional profit. They need more work. More work is structured by building the bill to involve only new projects, not projects in the pipeline. So that's going to be a key battle.
Thank you to all of you for doing the most compliment to anyone who writes a paper like this, which is taking it seriously and giving me great feedback on it. And so with that, I thank you. I find myself thinking, what you said, Governor, and some of the others, which is we have to do something. And I was reminded when I was a parent, my wife and I, a new parent, my wife and I used to fight about what are we going to do? Should we do A or B? We get in these knockdown, drag-out fights the way young parents do. I realized we're asking the wrong question. Thank God there's a plan B, because if there's no plan B, plan A must work, even in the face of information that it is not working. You end up with power struggles with your kids. It's sobering. We've done the regulation aspect. There's a lot of history around that causes some problems. I guess my question is are we at a historic opportunity to think outside the box and try to move forward? So let me throw out one example. The current chairman of the Federal Communications Commission launched an initiative called Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. And in matter of full disclosure, I'm a member of this committee, and I'm now obligated to tell you that nothing I say represents the views of the committee or the Federal Communications Commission. But the entire goal of this is to try to take advantage of a sea change in mentality, really, in my opinion, affected by Google Fiber. Before Google happened, when a telephone company or a cable company wanted to build, they said, okay, let's try to negotiate the franchise agreement and get money out of it. Google launched a reverse auction. They said, we're going to build a network. Who wants to make it easier on us? And whoever. And this has launched a debate where I think cities are now looking at these companies as potential partners, not opponents. And the whole purpose of the BDAC is to try to lower licensing times, licensing fees, and not licensing fees. Create a forum for fair assessment of licensing fees. But what we're discovering is when you want to build a 5G deployment, the build takes 4 to 6 months. The licensing takes 18 to 20. And that's just lost to me to the citizens, because then you've just got to commit. You've got an outcome we're all going to get to, and the faster we get to that outcome, the better. So the question I've got is is there room now? And I'll tell you right now, I'm also doing an international study of broadband deployments abroad, and there's some really interesting new technology ideas. Is this now the time for outside-the-box thinking? And if so, is this something that an academic institution might be able to help with?
I'll throw in, I agree with that. I think people are soft surprised when I say this. Google Fiber is one of the best things that happened to the industry in the last 10 or 15 years. And it just really, because it did break that mold open to get in and see what happened in Kansas City, Kansas, and then in Austin, say, if you lower the red tape, if you make it easier for you, you will see competitive entrance. And then what happened? AT&T and Time Warner, to the best of their ability, dropped pricing, and everybody seemed to win. Google has, since shelved a lot of these projects because, surprise, surprise, it really wasn't economical. We kind of knew that, but just seeing the success, I think that has motivated a lot of municipalities. I think the bigger battle going forward is going to be with small cells and wireless technology. I think some of these solutions, especially for some of these small towns, maybe unlicensed wireless and so forth, is a solution for access. There's a lot of that's the biggest impediment are what cities are charging several hundred, $150, $200 per light pole to hang up a small cell. For example, as many of you are aware, pole attachment rights are about $40 a year on a utility pole. So this suddenly gets a small cell build upside down. We've heard a lot. You may have read or heard a lot about small cell. A lot of investors ask about it. We don't see a whole lot of activity, and it's these kind of this kind of red tape that holds things up. That's a real challenge.
The answer is obviously yes. Most people think about these as purely innovations in technology as the sort of next thing we need to do. But in fact, new business models are often much more important than the technologies. And, if you go back to the 90s, for example, we had this big productivity boom. When they finally dug through all the data, half of it was due to big box retail. It was just selling the stuff at Walmart and Target and places like that. And so I'm always interested in ways to break open the business model and get sort of a different set of competitive pressures.
Fascinating. Some of the models we're starting to see, paid Wi-Fi is starting to make there's fascinating ideas. The problem that I want to emphasize, though, is these are all small cities. This is not, none of these things we're talking about in terms of fiber are solutions to rural deployments. We're a whole different set of problems. And I think, as Doug says correctly, and Frank notes, small cells for small cities make a lot of sense. What strikes me is people often fall in love with the technology. People fall in love with fiber and say we should do fiber everywhere. Countries that have been on fiber-only strategies have the worst rural deployments in the world. Why? Fiber doesn't build in rural areas. I mean, it's very, math is unforgiving.
So I think it's just, it's important, to, as I tried to highlight in my opening remarks, to figure out what problem you're trying to solve. Right? You can try to do too much. And, in the parenting context, my dissertation advisor, who's always the person who tells you the most about parenting, explained to me when I was going to have kids that you could get a kid to do anything, but you could never get a kid to do everything. So better figure out exactly what you care about and do that. And I think the same's true in these things. We sometimes try to solve too many problems with a single thing like a municipal broadband network. What problem are you trying to solve? Is it you want it cheaper? Is it that there's no access? Do you want to be set up for a next generation that isn't currently profitable? There are a lot of different ways to think about it, but be disciplined about what problems you're trying to solve.
Level. The BDAC has two separate committees. One's trying to solve things at the municipal level and write a municipal model code. The other's trying to go to the state level. And it's fairly clear in the discussions there's some tension between the two over the proper roles of each in helping solve these infrastructure problems. It appears to me that someone who's occupied the positions you have probably is better situated to have useful observations than anyone.
Yeah, there is no question that's the case, and it's not just in this broadband example. It's in virtually everything having to do with infrastructure. Cities are pushing hard right now to get a set-aside in any infrastructure bill so that if a state, let's say the formula, like the transportation formula, comes out and there's money sort of block granted to the states, that a portion of that go directly to the cities, and it doesn't have to pass through the state legislature, the governor, the state planning organizations, or the regional planning organizations. So there's a big push on among cities to get that done. I don't know that that will be very successful politically, for no other reason than Republicans control 36 out of the 50 state governors, and Republicans control about 2 out of the most 100 largest cities. So I think control is going to stay with the state. And then it depends on whether the governor cares about cities and is willing to take problems, assessment and evaluation, and willing to do something about it. Obviously, one of the strengths I brought to the job as governor was my understanding of the challenges that cities faced, and we listened to cities a great deal. Well, we did it voluntarily, not. I don't think you're going to see a mandate. I think that's a battle that the local government will always lose. And also state legislatures, for the same reason that congressional delegations, because of redistricting, they're top-heavy against cities. Pennsylvania, congressional Democrats got almost 150,000 more votes in the last election. Congressional Republicans did, but the Republicans won 13 out of 19 seats. So they got 150,000 less votes. So I think that is a question, and it's a good question, but I think politically the controls.
We would like to open up the floor to questions. My request is that if you ask some questions, we do have a microphone and it will be passed around. Identify yourself and your organization. Make your speech in the form of a
Dr. Ryan, anybody interested in what cities' major concerns are? There's a very good paper put out by Next Century Cities, Emerging Issues in Expanding Next Generation Internet Access. So I would recommend that paper to you.
This was touched on by Frank.
Walt.
I'm Walter Johnson with the Office of Engineering Technology at the FCC. Frank Lujan, I think, touched on this question, but I wanted to ask Christopher Yoo. Over a 40-year project, a municipality would have to do at least 4 major upgrades to a broadband network to maintain it as a competitive commercial enterprise. When you looked at these projects, how much of the planning and expense planning went into ensuring that over the lifetime of the project, the network remained competitive from a
Reality of the financial performance. That far. We did documents that were used to sell investment community to the voter community, to everyone else. And what we discovered is that they were off plan even before the first upgrades went through. The ones that went off plan quickly. And so I understand the problem you're making, but in many ways, before you even get to the first upgrade, if you can't make it there, you're not even there. This is a standard problem that a lot of companies have, though. I mean, what struck me is, to take it to a slightly different context, the Home Depot security breach was done because someone took a memory stick, flash memory drive, and stuck it into a point-of-sale terminal, a cash register, and put the virus on. And it's because it was a 30-year-old register. And they don't think about that or try to avoid it as part of their capital planning when all these companies have to understand that they're technology companies now. And that replacement cycle for a technology company is 5 years. If that, and particularly forget the operational stuff, just to keep in touch with the security patches and just to keep your network sound for the benefit of your users, you have to build that in. The concern is that if you look at the planning documents, it is an extraordinarily rosy scenario that is presented to a lot of these decision makers, not just mayors, but city council members as well. And one of my purposes was to try to make sure that they had real performance history to check against that. And then they can ask someone, I understand what you're saying. I have these other numbers, how these other cities have tried very hard to do. Why is this going to be different? And there may be an answer to that question, but it is a question that needs to be asked and answered.
And I will say that obviously is a good point, and it raises the cost of doing something. But until you can provide an answer to mayors about the cost of doing nothing, you're not going to stop municipal investment, because the economic viability of cities and particularly smaller and mid-sized cities, their existence is challenged in Pennsylvania and Texas and California and Ohio and Montana, you name it. Their existence is up for grabs in the very next decade, and internet access is absolutely essential to give them the tool to have some chance to fight back.
Sandeep Taksali with NTIA. I'll ask this question not using my NTIA hat, but my former hat as a CPA and as a consultant to AT&T, Comcast, and many of the companies that funded your study or your institute, which is that when we looked at a business case for a network greenfield build, we always, from a cash flow perspective, usually we went out about 10 years with terminal value, or we would go 15 to 20 years out. Because every business case for greenfield, most business cases were dogs. If you applied your method, 5 years of cash flow with no long-term analysis with terminal value, or just the fact that many of these business cases turned drastically positive in years 10 to 20. So I'm just curious, what motivated you to only go 5 years out?
We didn't go 5 years out. First, we use a 30 to 40-year horizon. We just took 5 years of data based on the projects that we had. The oldest municipal fiber project of which data exists is 14 years old. as of 2014. And I guess I could have gone back and got last year's data and the year, but we just had to write the study when we wrote it. I wish I had more mature data. It simply doesn't exist. And this is, all data has limitations. Financial statements have their limitations. It's just, this is the highest quality data we have. Now, what can we do? We can look at the oldest case studies and look at the pattern of revenue growth and see how they're doing and see, are they still growing? Are they still doing it? And in fact, what you see in the older ones, they're flattening out pretty badly at year 14. And you know, in the beginning, especially in the very beginning years, you should see meteoric growth because the denominator is so tiny. You know, the first year it's infinite growth because you're going from zero. The second year, you know, you expect like 100% growth and all this, and then you start to project out, and then you can take those projections and try to see where they would go. And that's one of the reasons, the reason we did the regressions with all those risks in it, is to try to get some traction rather than vapor as to what the actual data is telling us about the likely projections. Would I invest my future mortgage on that? No. It's not that quality. But if you have no data, to me, it seemed like the best quality data we had. But to be clear, we weren't looking at 15-year payouts. One of the reasons I ran the S-curve and the linear ones is to try to project based on those rates what would be a reasonable projection of where it would go. And we still get 100-year payback rates, which to me is unrealistic. I don't know anyone that would finance that because it's just not going to fly. But within the 10 to 15-year range, actually, we do have data. And that's the one that suggests that over 14 years, it'll lose about $3,000 a household. And if it's not debt financed, then the voters need to know that. And many of them may be willing to vote $3,000 a household to pay for that. What we're discovering in some cities where they've had the referenda, they're not. And that's something for the local voters to decide. Yeah. Yes. I agree. So the problem with any study, there's always more we can add into it. You know, and the thing is, this is uniform data which we can treat with generally. I want that number or a number in someone's head so they can make a clear decision. And it is ultimately up for individual cities to decide what to do.
Yeah, I actually just want to defend the way this was done. I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of heroic calculations, and what this tells you is the order of magnitude of the payback period. I mean, I don't think anyone believes they got down to the third decimal right, but you know, there's a big difference between 10 and 100, and knowing that, I think, is what you get out of the paper.
Hi, I'm Rich Clark with AT&T. I have a number of questions about the data. You describe it as audited financial reports or SEC data. I assume those two are different, that the SEC data is ex ante data that would be in a bond prospectus or something like this, so it's just projections, it's not actuals.
Yes.
And the financial reports, these would be ones that would be by the city agency. They follow like GASP rules, which I'm not very familiar with. I'm wondering if there's any ability to compare those to what, let's say, an FCC Part 32 rule would look like in terms of depreciation lives, or in particular also separations assumptions between how you would divide the costs of the broadband business versus the electrical business. Further information about that I'd find useful.
So I actually don't know the FCC rules well enough. I will tell you, so the SEC filings are what are called the official statements filed with the SECs. The organ that does municipal bounds, which is called the MSRB. And they always file something called the official statement that projects what the use of the funds is going to be. And they will tell you, we're raising $200 million in bonds, 160 of this is going to go to broadband, 20 million is going to go to financing the overhead of the bonds, and we can actually get their plan picture. There's always going to be a deviation between the plan and the actuals, but that's what people made ex-ante decisions based on, and it's probably as good as we're going to get. The audit financial statements follow GASB. This is the reason I like it is it's what the investment community uses to make decisions. You know, it's the standard recording. It has probably different depreciation schedules than others, but frankly, because we're backing out depreciation, it doesn't matter as much. Because cash flow, depreciation is a non-cash expense, and one of the purposes of that calculation is to take that back out. We're actually just looking at operationally how much cash did this thing soak up in terms of its actual operations, and hopefully that will minimize all that. There's got to be questions about what expenses are, but my guess is those are going to be much narrower than the kinds of the bigger issues you have about depreciation, which can make financial returns look dramatically different, but actually have no impact on cash whatsoever.
From my perspective, any sort of FCC accounting data is pretty much worthless for financial analysis, just for what it's worth.
For calculating the life cycle profitability of something as opposed to the annual profitability of something, I have a fondness for a number of FCC rules.
I'm sure you do.
Even though they are now part of history.
But to clarify this, the report is not looking at profitability. It's looking at solvency. So there are many, so think about the characteristic investment. You borrow a ton of money by issuing a bond, and then you spend it all immediately within the first few years before you even get revenue. And that should be more or less equal. And then you get revenue every year, and then you retire the bond at the end. And the thing that we worry about is, are you going to have enough cash at the end of the day to retire that bond? And to do that, you don't actually bank profit. Because one of the things that you'll learn in business school, actually a wildly profitable company that's growing rapidly has to be expanding factories. They're just sucking up cash, and in fact can go bankrupt because they don't have enough cash to do operations, even though they're vastly profitable. And this is one of the funny things about it. So people have said, well, is this report about return on investment? The answer is no. We're not interested in profitability. We want to make sure, this is trying to assess how likely are cities going to have enough cash at the end of the day to retire their bond obligations without having to default on them. And for that purpose, as much as you may like the AT&T, the old FCC rules, I think that this is actually a fairly effective way to analyze them.
Interestingly, one of the prior questioners said something, who was talking about the $3,000 per household investment over 15 years, $200 a household per year. Balance that against the benefit. Well, when we do economic calculations, one of the weaknesses, and this is a huge weakness in the federal budgeting process, is there never any offsets for the revenue that's generated from what you're doing. The cost, we know what the costs are, because they're hard costs usually. But let's say that this mayor whose town was bereft of any economic development decides to take a shot and develops access at a reasonable price. All of a sudden, young entrepreneurs start coming in, and they're producing a lot of business taxes, maybe wage taxes, corporate taxes, et cetera, whatever the tax structure is. Do we put that revenue into the mix, figuring out what's the balance sheet? And if it cost X, but they produced Y in new revenue, then Y should be subtracted from X. And we never do that. We don't score that way in the federal budget. We never do that. And again, it's tough to calculate, but sometimes it isn't so tough to calculate. For example, an infrastructure program that would spend $200 billion a year in extra money, the money above and beyond what we're spending now. If you take the DOT calculation, which is pretty accurate because we got $1 billion from stimulus for roads and highways in Pennsylvania, and I tracked the number of jobs created. That would create an additional the ratio is 25,000 jobs for $1 billion of investment in infrastructure. That would create a $200 billion investment would create, I guess, somewhere near 5 million new jobs. And if it was on a 10-year basis, those jobs would continue. Each year you'd spend $200 billion. Well, just the income taxes from those jobs, no less than net profit tax from the companies and the manufacturers, that's never computed. And to get a real good read on what you're doing, you've got to understand that those computations go into the mix. And as a mayor, I was always cognizant of the cost versus the new revenue we would generate.
And actually, Tim and I ran this calculation. We ultimately didn't include it because it started getting farther and farther from the core data, and to me, it's a separate paper. But I did ask myself, I looked at the tax base, we pulled it for each city, and said, what would the tax base have to go up to make this solvent? I mean, again, looking at the impact on the city itself. And you can actually get an estimated number. We may not know if it's realized, but then on an ex ante basis, if I need X percent to pay it out, a city can say, how likely is that to happen? Now, the problem we've got is property tax, sales tax, income tax. We started trying to figure out which business taxes, trying to figure out what the rates are. And pretty much you all of a sudden have so many assumptions sitting in it, it became something very different from the sort of data-based analysis we have. It's now a modeling exercise, which is useful. But we ultimately decided not to include it in this paper just to keep it as clean as we could.
It's interesting. That's a good point. You never know. We did a program. We had an economic stimulus plan when I became governor because there was a recession in 2002. And the stimulus, it was before economic stimulus got a bad name. And it was very successful. We put in about $2.7 billion of state bond money and loan guarantees. We generated $19 billion in private sector investment. But what was good about it is one of the programs was something called the Infrastructure Improvement Program, IFIP. And it was for nonprofits who couldn't get the benefit of tax credits. What we did for them was we said, okay, you want money up front to help you with your upfront cost of building this new hospital. Tell us how many employees you're going to add in the next 10 years, and you can give us the schedule. 200 the first year, 500 the second year, 500 the third year. Tell us what your average salary is going to be. We'll compute the state income tax, and we'll give you the total money that you'll pay in state income tax in 10 years with a clawback. So if you don't produce the jobs at that salary benefit at the end of the 10 years, we get the difference. If you only produced $8 million of state income tax and we gave you 10 up front, you owe us 2. So there are ways to calculate it and fix it in so you don't lose, and that it's not a hypothetical process. But again, the most important point is there's got to be some set aside because you can't just judge cost without judging benefit. And I'm not even talking about benefit in the quality of life, benefit to individual citizens. I'm talking about benefit to the treasury of the political subdivision.
As the next question's being asked, I should clarify one thing, Sandy, we're friends, but this project was not supported by anyone except the University of Pennsylvania. And
This
so,
gentleman's been trying to answer.
so well, Larry, I promise you're next. No, go ahead, please.
Hi, Nick Degani with the FCC. 2 quick questions. First, were any of these projects where there was not already a municipal electric utility?
No.
So to go back to one of the governor's questions, if a city does not actually have a municipal electric utility, is this really even a viable idea to even start talking about?
Before this year, I would have said no. There are 3 cities trying to do it now. Sandy, Oregon, Ammon, Idaho, and Westminster, Maryland. And we'll see. I mean, the problem is trying to develop the rights of way and access to that. If there's a way they can get it through some other means, it's possible. But that's an additional cost that these other municipal electrical utilities didn't have to bear. So this is how we find out. The beautiful thing about this model is cities are making bold experiments, putting their own real tax money at stake to try something they believe in. And the good news is people are trying enough different things. We learn a lot in the process. I hope it works for them. But we'll have to wait and see.
Are those terrestrial networks or wireless?
They're terrestrial.
Okay.
They're laying fiber. And it's pretty heroic, actually.
Thank you, Christopher. Larry Spivak from the Phoenix Center. A question for the governor. I'm listening to you talk. The problem with, I think, overall the telecom policy debate is that, like a guitarist wanting one more, we keep looking for one more network. And the problem is that there's an equilibrium. The market can sustain X amount. So a lot of the problem with the municipal broadband debate is, okay, I live in Function Junction, Western Pennsylvania. There's nobody there. Nobody wants to serve. Because that's really the heart. It's like, why is there municipal broadband? Because nobody else wants to go. But then you have instances like Chattanooga or the Philadelphia wireless experience, which is well served by the private sector. And if you have an equilibrium and then you add one more firm, somebody's going to go out of business. And the problem with municipal broadband is, it's the old line, is you can't compete against City Hall. So somebody from the private sector, because in the paper we did last year for the State Government Leadership Foundation, it's predatory entry. Okay, for the case of Chattanooga, not only did they get subsidized by EPB, but they also got a subsidized by the BTOP fund. Okay, so it wasn't just from other Tennesseans; it was from people who live in, Montgomery County, Maryland, or Montgomery County, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, excuse me, who were subsidizing. Now, I think there's an issue with that. So at the end of the day, I'd like to know what your thought is about this notion of fighting City Hall with the private sector. The D.C. Circuit came out with a case last year that said that that actually violates due process. The government cannot be both regulator and competitor. And I think that's the problem that we're talking about, that nobody's addressing with municipal broadband. Your argument is essentially that, well, what's the cost of doing nothing? But to be blunt, when one is talking about, economic development, it's like crack to a local mayor. Let's build a fountain, let's build a sports stadium. So how do you rectify that? Because at some day, we're not talking about where nobody else wants to go. We're talking about crowding at an equilibrium, which means somebody in the private sector is going to go bust.
But generally, though, the cities aren't the regulator. Cities have very little power to regulate. But your competition argument sort of makes sense until you think that Paris has 6 providers. Philadelphia has 2. Or what's the difference? My guess is it's because in Paris, you can piggyback onto a telecom.
So you're advocating local loop unbundling again. You're arguing rate regulation, local loop unbundling.
Tell me why this industry should be different than the energy industry and water. Anybody give me a good argument?
Actually, it's, if you will, there's a paper. This is, as every academic will say, I have a paper on this.
As do we. And as a former FERC attorney, I can give you a long dissertation on that. But
just give me the debate
places,
answer.
Because
the
the
They're
economics,
monopolies. They're
there is
regulated
clearly,
monopolies.
well, yeah, I
places
mean,
it
it doesn't
works-
make sense to build 2 transmission lines. We can barely build 1.
So the places this works well is where the transport infrastructure is already built out. It's not changing. The product is a commodity like water, natural gas. It's very easy to determine what prices and products are. And that, in fact, what we've seen historically is telephone used to be more like that. Broadband is much less like that. And when you've actually run the numbers, the reason the prices are the way they are in France is because they're all reselling the same facility through regulated access to it. There's the old France Telecom network. That keeps prices down, but their investment's 2.5 times lower than ours. And the flip side of this is the numbers you make on that you showed up there are accurate, but the funny thing is Americans use about twice as much broadband as what the French do. And so the prices are naturally going to be higher, but the answer is they don't use it as much because they don't actually get the kind of service that we do. And I still remember, I won't out my friend, but there's a friend of mine who is very tied to sort of the advocates the other way, and she came back from doing a PhD in England. She says, I'll never complain about broadband prices again because I couldn't get 50 meg service at any price in Oxford. And
in where?
Oxford, Oxford, England.
Well, she must have a problem because the speed of broadband service in UK is about 20% faster than
It's interesting. So
in America.
The entire UK is basically a DSL country. They've got cable in about half the country. The rest of it is all old phone lines. And it depends. There's different speeds you measure, and there's different ways to measure it. But the general things, whether it's looking at Cisco or Akamai, it's about 6 to 10 meg. And it's very interesting.
But I still haven't heard a good answer of why we regulate water and energy and we don't regulate internet access. What's the difference? Someone said it's not as creative. Well, gosh, the energy market is booming with new inventions and new sources of energy, algae, wind, solar, all these new things that are cropping up. You can take methane from cows, and the cows give off in the digestion process and make energy out of it. I mean, what's the difference?
Oh. Yeah.
We regulate price.
James, why don't you
But
go
we
ahead?
regulate price that the consumer pays.
Thanks. James Miller, the FCC, Office of Engineering and Technology. I wanted to follow up on some of the cost questions, if I could, from Governor Rendell, and then Christopher, if you could maybe respond a little bit. Understanding that there's a congealing of sort of the sunk costs of the installation and sort of making the platform available, separate from the running costs associated with running a telecommunications or a broadband service. And my question is, understanding that, acquiring networks and trying to integrate, all the technology of an existing sort of target is complicated, in addition to conforming all of sort of the O&M sort of related rules. Certainly, acquiring telecommunications companies isn't costless, but, you look at the numbers, $2,200 per subscriber, just off the cuff sort of, cocktail napkin math, maybe you're making $700 or $1,400, per person. Obviously someone has got a business model that's working on that. Why isn't this maybe an interesting sort of topic of, there's an infrastructure development, maybe it gets, running for a while, and then someone that actually wants to take over the operating and maintenance of those networks steps in with maybe more ability to bring those costs down per subscriber. And then maybe we're looking at a 50-year investment, just like we would have rural electrification in the 30s or something.
Well, the 2,200 number per household actually is a pretty lousy number. Verizon, this is all by analyst reports. This isn't official, it's based on estimates the Wall Street people have said. They had basically $750 per home pass, plus $750 hookup costs. That's 1/3 what the home pass number is here, and Verizon couldn't really make it go. And so it's 3 times that's a tough number actually to make pay out. And so I wouldn't, soft pedal that at all. Here's the other problem. If the scenario you're talking about unfolds, and a private company is going to come in and buy the asset from a city, the sunk costs are allocated. They're not going to pay them for it. And in fact, what you see when on these fire sales, which happen when the companies are shedding so much red ink, they tend to get 10 cents, 20 cents on the dollar of what they invested. And the reality is the city on that model is left holding the debt. And so, there are 5 cities, it's in a footnote, I can give you exactly how much each one of them paid and how much each of them got. And the story that always sticks in my head is this tiny little city called Dunalon, Florida, less than 2,000 people, unserved. So they thought, let's go do this. Borrowed $7 million, ran $2.5 million a year for 2 years. The whole city budget was $3 million. Sold it for $1 million, left holding $6 million in debt, twice their annual budget. That city is crippled for over a decade. And if it had turned out that they thought they were going to get 3,000 subscribers, they got 500. And that's the risk, is that when you have that sort of situation where you're counting on someone, a white knight, to come bail you out, I don't think you should expect to be paid fair value, because any economist would talk to you about sunk cost opportunism. There's no reason they're going to pay you for money you've already spent out the door. They're going to look at your operation cash flow and what you're going to get out of it.
But I think the point you're making is a good one. Where most of this fails is because cities shouldn't be in this business. Just like Philadelphia owns its own gas works. We're the only city in America that owns its own gas works. We shouldn't be in the business. We don't know how to run a gas works. Government generally doesn't know how to run virtually any business. So it's a problem. And what the professor said is correct, but what a city could do is do the initial build out and then contract out the management of it to professionals who could hold down costs and maybe know how to generate additional revenue, know how to market it well, as the private sector often does. So I'm against, if mayors would ask me whether they should do this, I would say absolutely not. Very last resort, don't do it. But the answer is, if they're not going to do it, if the bottom line of the professor's paper is don't do it, what do they do? What in the heck answer are we going to give them? Young lady, you have an answer?
Well, I have a few thoughts. So first, I think that for most cities that do it, it is a last resort. I think that we work with a lot of cities who are doing this, and they would argue with your point that the private sector is willing to serve them. I think that they feel like they go to the private sector, they ask them to serve, and the business case just isn't there. So that's why they're doing it in the first place. Professor Yoo, I thought your report is really interesting. I thought it's interesting that the OpEx is so high. I think that is surprising to me, and it does maybe validate what Westminster is doing, which is building the passive infrastructure and then having a private sector come over and operate it from there. And we'll see, it's new, but there are other cities that are doing it, and the financials look a little bit better than when the municipality is just doing it all by themselves. One question / comment. When you did your list of caveats, one of the things that I didn't see listed, but I think that in a lot of your examples makes a big difference, are the state laws. So in a lot of states, so 20 states have restrictions on municipal broadband, and they range from all-out prohibitions to restrictions that could make the financial viability much different. So for in some states, cities are only allowed to provide broadband internet access services, and they're not able to provide television services or telephone services. So when you're competing against Comcast, who has a triple play package, or other providers, Comcast, AT&T, any other private sector provider that's able to do a triple play package, being able to only do broadband internet access services just doesn't make the product as viable. So I think that that's at least something that should go into the caveats, that, maybe there are some state laws that impact the financial viability of some of these products.
Totally correct. So what I would say is the wholesale passive network is an interesting model. It's actually been done in a couple cases in the data set with great lack of success. The most prominent one is Utopia. And I mean, this is the thing that there's individual things you can say about every case, but the thing is, you look across the whole data set, and they all can't be exceptions. I mean, the hope is by looking at a larger number of them. There's a bunch of European places that do this. Regifiber is doing this. A bunch in the Netherlands. They almost all use what Google now does, which is called demand aggregation, which is you make people sign up in advance before you build. That lowers the risk dramatically for the companies, and maybe that's a way we can go forward. We used to call that redlining. And this is the tension. This is one of the things that I think Google Fiber has changed the focus. So yes, what can a city do? If it were a greenfield city which wasn't getting service and there's no business case, that's the case I'm the most sympathetic to. A large number of these cases were already served. And that is it makes the proposition much riskier. Second is, the whole BDAC goal is to try to find ways to take things that used to be seen as adversarial and think about them as cooperative, and to try to find ways to lower those barriers, because I think what we may be at an impasse is that the part of the business case that is so problematic is the 18 to 24-month licensing period. Is that if we can start to lubricate some of those things, some of those marginal cases will pop on. Will it solve all of them? No. But if we wait for the perfect solution, we will be waiting forever, which is the governor's nightmare. The question is on a tactical basis, can we find interventions that solve this problem, this problem, this problem? And frankly, for the last X% of the U.S., it's just going to be very, very hard. I mean, no one's really got those answers. But right now, to me, the place to work is the place where we actually have some leverage in solving some of the problems.
And I would just add one caveat to the caveat. And that is the places that the professor says were already served. You have to look at what the pricing structure is and what the speed was. It's like saying everyone has access to a Mercedes. If they're served because a company is saying, we really don't want to do this, so we'll charge so much money that no one will sign up, it's not really being served. It's like having no access.
Hi, Rick Zimmerman from NCTA. Just want to give my Philadelphia bona fides. First, my wife is from Philly. My brother was born there. I was born in Camden, New Jersey, across the river.
Those aren't bona fides.
Well, my mom was a grad student at Penn, and, so it was hospital here, hospital there, et cetera, back in the day. Just on that last point, first, I just want to point out that most national broadband providers or major broadband providers have nationwide pricing, if you will. So I don't think there are places where, prices are so high. I do have to question the building where something already exists with the idea that the government should get into the business to bring prices down. That's not the core function of government. It's sidewalks, it's police. I mean, I hate to be telling the former mayor and governor the core function, but
how's the airline industry doing?
And bring prices down.
How's the American airline industry doing?
It doesn't make sense to get in and compete.
How's the American airline
But that
industry
actually
doing?
let me segue to my actual question / point question, which is Frank said and Christopher, you've also mentioned Google Fiber, which really has broken things open. And now we have gigabit deployments coming across the country. Just yesterday, Mediacom, which is maybe the 6th or 7th largest cable operator, announced a rollout of gigabit broadband to 275 small and medium-sized cities in Illinois. They previously have blanketed the state of Iowa with gigabit broadband. Comcast has its own gigabit deployments. Cox has Gigablast rolling out all over the place. Midco in North Dakota, South Dakota, and part of Minnesota they were going to roll out something called Gigabit Frontier until Frontier Communications complained about the name. So now it's just called Gigabit Service, whatever, but they're rolling out throughout the Dakotas Gigabit Service. My point is, even since 2014, and this data you measured, there are all sorts of new deployments going on. And, I hate to take issue with the FCC's speed definition and therefore how many providers there are or aren't. But I think the picture is much rosier, and I know Doug Brake is here of ITIF, not to call him out. And Christopher, you yourself, as the good host, haven't wanted to really take on the governor on these international speed comparisons and what's so erroneous about them as a basis for making policy. But maybe offline you can do that. But I do just want to say that I think we need to take these new deployments into account, and would be interested how communities are going to do that going forward.
I'm sorry I quoted a reprehensible source like the FCC.
So, Rick. So Rick.
And you still haven't answered my question about how the airline industry is doing.
So actually, I would have to say that it's, in terms of consumer prices, as a whole, as an industry, since 1978, it's doing spectacularly well. I mean,
There's three of them that are left.
I understand. So the hard part about this is there are certain pairwise routes, Philadelphia to Pittsburgh being among the most notorious, which are problematic. I mean, the prices are extremely high, cost about $1,000.
But we went from 14 to 3, and we lost a boatload of jobs,
But if you look at the routes across the country, prices are down. And my favorite route, I actually flew what was once the most expensive route in the U.S., which was Boston to Philly before there was competition. It cost me $1,000 once. It's now about $60 each way. Why? Because they've got the route structure done to make that work. Now, the most interesting problem, one of the biggest challenges in competitiveness in airlines is actually gate control by the cities and the municipal airport authorities. And we thought that this would become what we call the contestable market, and the sticking point has actually been the charges on the gates. And so I really don't want this to turn into an airline discussion, but my point is, like with most of these things, there's a lot of facts. There's a lot of truth to what you're saying. I've flown that Pittsburgh route. It drives me crazy every time I do it.
And you have to understand what US Air used to, now American does, is every time there's a competitor that decides we're going to try to capture that Philadelphia to Pittsburgh market, US Air drops its prices dramatically, forces the competitor off the line, and as soon as the competitor's off the line, they raise the prices up again. It's working real well.
Will Reinhardt, American Action Forum. I'm just wondering if in the regressions you did or took into consideration the network architecture. One of the things that I was just in Dallas a couple weeks ago talking to some of the broadband communities, that essentially the groups that actually do these kinds of deployment. One of the things I've noticed in talking to a number of the people who are actually doing the deployments themselves at the municipal level, one of the guys from Rawls County, Missouri, which is kind of a more recent development, is that he specifically said, don't do head-in infrastructure, don't include the head-in at all. And then he also talked extensively about the difference between Ethernet versus GPON. I'm just wondering if you have any sense of what the network architecture actually, if it matters in the cost deployment, if that was taken in consideration, and if you see, at least now, more trends away from building everything within the network and trying to get some of those elements outside of the network and to basically just lease that access.
So it's an interesting question. So almost all of these are GPON deployments because they're all classic fiber deployments. The Ethernet experiment is a really interesting one. And this is an example of how we need to be thinking really outside the box. One of the things that strikes me, though, is whether you allocate, you're saying don't allocate the head-ends or don't build a head-end at all. Yeah. So this is the over-the-top model where you don't do video. The problem with the conventional understanding in the business is if you don't do video, you won't pay out your network. I mean, the problem is you need to be able to put a value proposition in front of customers, and everyone I know believes that you have to be selling video or else you'll never make it. And so this is the problem with the triple play question that I didn't fully answer before. I understand that that's a problem, but this is actually why the primary reason Google's struggling has actually nothing to do with the network. A lot of it has to do with content acquisition and building video, is that they don't have the scale to negotiate effectively with the studios, which is an example to me of how this whole system works. You have to be a triple play provider. Well, you have to be doing video and data to survive, triple play voice as well. And the pricing there, if you look at the cost, it is, by any stretch of the imagination, the numbers, content acquisition is driving those costs, not the networking. If you look at the rates that they're paying, and in fact, unless you have the negotiating leverage to make that work, it's really, really hard to do. The other thing you said, I just realized I never answered, is state laws. This is the thing, the trap in doing these big studies. You can look at each individual state and treat them, they all have unique characteristics. The thing we have to do is find common things and common threads across them, because the funny thing is, two of the examples in the study, Wilson, North Carolina, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, are in states that ban broad fiber, but they're grandfathered in, and there's all these funny things that we go around them. My guess is it's still worth looking at in terms of their actual performance, because oddly enough, those are two of the most highly touted installations, and I would say they're not on track to cover their costs right now, and that's a tough one.
I'll throw in there, regardless of what kind of technology we're talking about, the cost here is in the labor, and that doesn't go down. So you have guys in trucks and digging trenches and running fiber and so forth. That's a vast majority of the cost. So whether it's a different type of architecture really isn't going to make that much of a difference. It'll make more of a difference on the throughput and then maybe the ongoing cost. But the bulk of the initial cost is going to be in the labor. And on the video side, smaller I understand about having a triple play bundle and how that makes it more attractive. I would argue that would make it even worse for municipality. Professor Yoo's point, the content costs for Comcast, okay, the largest provider out there, were up double-digit percentages last year. And they have the most scale in the industry in AT&T. Most small providers will tell you they don't make money on video, and they're trying to get out of it. In fact, I've got some of the companies that I follow that they're starting leading with data first. Hey, you want Netflix and data? Great. Let's drop our video product. And so I think that's even, over time, that's the direction it's going to head.
But this is the critical difference between overbuilding an existing installation and a new one. If you've got an existing provider, you have to be able to provide a better level of service and charge them more for it to justify the upgrade. Because if you have a baseline level of service and you're going to invest in doing something higher than that, someone has to be willing to pay more than what they're getting on the low bandwidth and have to deliver value for it, or it has to be done with public money. And this is the difficult truth, which is, the funny thing is, in this world it means monetizing video, which is the big value in higher bandwidth, because the only thing that really needs really high bandwidth at this point is video, is whether effective monetization of video is what you need for building out fiber. Because it's hard to build the business case for digging all those trenches. We've got a lot of interesting innovations in Google Fiber. Truck rolls is the death of the industry. I mean, that's the most labor-intensive thing they do, and the industry is always trying to avoid it. Google did something really interesting. They said, we will build your neighborhood once, and we're not coming back for 5 years. So better get on it now, or we're not coming back. And the answer is, it simplified their costs dramatically. Why? They went down a street once, hooked up all the houses that were going on, and didn't do the others. Now, if I were a consumer advocate, if I was sitting in a city hall, the idea that a customer couldn't get service on demand would generate a lot of complaints. You can do that. There's a cost. And it's going to show up in the bills, and it's going to show up in the service. And these are the tough calls that actually Google was able to convince Kansas City to let them to innovate in terms of business models, as both Frank and Doug were making. And that's a really interesting innovation that actually changes the economics in a pretty dramatic way. Interesting. Google's talking about micro-trenching, which is something we historically haven't allowed. That's an interesting, and that's what Liberty Global is doing in Europe right now in the cable industry. That's really interesting. Low voltage stuff that we not requiring to be 6 feet down may make a difference. And this is actually pretty exciting to me.
Jonathan Howenchild from the American Legislative Exchange Council. Kind of a quick comment and then a related question. I know with the FCC's numbers, I think it was since 2011, 2012, the FCC decided to start excluding everything but wireline. So even though Congress requires the broadband reports to include all alternatives, mobile and satellite as well, the FCC just unilaterally decided to start including wireline. So 2012 through present, I believe it is, the numbers only include what wireline. And I think that's, segueing into the question, when looking especially at the municipal broadband projects, was there any data regarding whether people, like especially in underserved areas, maybe the rural areas that weren't wired, the degree to which they used mobile and whether they moved from mobile or satellite to broadband, and whether the municipalities improperly calculated their numbers of people that would switch to the municipal broadband?
There's no actual switching data on wireless. This is something that I've always been frustrated with. I always thought there should be more data about this. But I think that there is a classic mistake which is being made in the way the debate's framed. First, it bugs me. I used to look at those wireless numbers every 6 months. I love them just because you find out what's going on. I'm frustrated we don't have them anymore. But what's fascinating to me about wireline and wireless is people assert that it's not a substitute. I would say that the internet is not a single product anymore. I would say for email, mobile is a very good substitute. For text messaging, it's a very good substitute. And in fact, not only is it's not a good substitute, it's better. You get mobility with email, photography. There's a lot of things we do now better through wireless. What it's not a good substitute, and for things like web browsing, the things we usually do, universal service stuff, getting government information, applying for jobs, are very low bandwidth things. So what we're talking about is video. What it's not a substitute for is video. And the question is it a policy commitment that we should be using effectively universal service or that type of funding to fund video connectivity? And the thing that struck me is, one, that entertainment is not what I always think of the purpose of universal service. And two, we already do that. We call it broadcasting. It is why we give away spectrum licenses for free, to connect people to video who don't have that money already. Now, this is a particular rant that I've actually never said in public. I've said it to my students in classes. But thinking through, my point in the larger one is the internet, thinking about whether wireless versus wireline is a substitute simpliciter sort of begs a lot of interesting questions. My guess is for some things it is. For some things it may not be. But I will say this. Europe, they're starting to include wireless and wireline, mobile and fixed internet in the same product market for regulatory purposes. Austria's the first one. They have 24%, I think. It's 2 years old data. I have to go back and look. Wireless-only households. And there's clearly, they think there's wireless to wireline substitution in broadband.
When a reporting entity changes how they report data, again, I point out that's usually not for the reader's benefit.
All right. Anyway, I saw another hand before I leave it. Go ahead. One more question. And at this point, I will say, unless there's other questions, you may have the honor of the last.
Hi, Nick Degani again from FCC. So just a question you said earlier, Professor Yoo, about the cost of video. With the move towards over-the-top and the increasing move towards bundled packages of over-the-top services like Sling, or Sling TV, I should say, do you see that as a new opportunity for entry into the broadband marketplace? Because if video becomes less important and is right now a cash loser for some, does that mean that there may be opportunities for those cord cutters or cord nevers to purchase service from new competitive ISPs or others?
I think the answer is we'll wait, we'll see. Clearly, possibly yes. The skinny bundles and the dish product where ESPN's going on its own, which people said would never happen, are really interesting. So who hates this idea? Discovery Network hates this idea. C-SPAN hates this idea because they depend on this is why they've always opposed unbundling, and that the diversity of programming potentially under a huge threat. But what's even more interesting to me, it's not clear whether this is good for broadband deployment, because they're not going to pay the content acquisition costs anymore. They're going to be carrying a lot more over the top that used to be done on specialized spectrum that's going to move to pure internet IP open spectrum. They're not going to be able to do this sort of separate channels for specialized services that we currently do with video if it's true over the top. And the economics are going to change pretty fundamentally in ways that are not entirely clear. But what's going to happen then is the over-the-top, as that volume increases, the question is who's going to pay for those bandwidth upgrades? And it can only happen one of two ways. It can happen in the subscription price that the end user pays the network provider, in which case it'll be built uniformly into the price regardless of how much they use. So my mother-in-law, the email user, her rate would go up unless we do tiered pricing where you pin it on the people who are using the bandwidth. Or the other alternative is you have the subscription, the over-the-top player do a direct interconnect with a side payment to the network provider. Part of the pay for the upgrade comes from the subscription rate they pay to the OTT provider, and it comes back through directly. The question I have as a policy standpoint, should we have an ex-ante preference for either business model? And people talk about double payment by the consumer. In the end, the consumer is the source of all the value no matter how you cut it. I mean, they're essentially paying. It's just a question of how they structure the payment. I've never been fully heard a convincing case about why a regulator should have an ex-ante preference for structuring a payment in one way versus the other. And I think it'd be really interesting to see how those dominoes would all fall through to figure out which would actually be better for American subscribers.
From my perspective, I'm not sure how much it incents new network investment, but it certainly shifts the power back to providers that don't have a large established linear video platform. Suddenly, if it's moving over the top, it's just a matter of what you can do with the broadband perspective, and that widens the playing field a bit. So it sort of does, but it definitely increases the competition.
And to me, the takeaway on a lot of this is one of the things that disturbs me is people try to make things seem really simple. They're not. Anyone who does this business knows they're not, and that in fact, the cases, I think everyone tries to, particularly for DC policy audiences, try to get very simple policy inferences. And if it were that easy, Governor Rendell would just have a very clear, easy answer for a lot of these things, and we'd have models, and those problems solve themselves. I think what we're having here is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of opportunity. But as you know, most opportunities don't pan out. And what we have to do is, I think, is create a policy flexible world where different actors, different cities who want to build without right of way have the ability to do so. And we can find out that's how the rest of us learn, is from the brave individuals who are really willing to experiment with different things. But I do think we need to learn and to get hard looks at data. And as Frank keeps saying, I do always wonder when you don't see the data, it's often because someone doesn't want you to see something. And so taking a hard look at the data that exists, I think, is something that we as academics can contribute to this. And I hope that with the program that we've done today and the paper we did today, that Tim and I are releasing today, will be the start of a helpful conversation in terms of moving this forward. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here, and please join me in thanking Governor Rendell, Frank, and Doug and Extension.